David, thanks for being here today.
Well, thanks for having me, Eric.
Yeah, it's exciting, and you've got a unique perspective of the S4 HANA and just the SAP ecosystem in general, having covered it now for TechTarget and just in general for over 10 years now, right? You've been covering this space?
Yes. Mhm.
Yeah, so I'm really curious to get your feedback on sort of the state of the S4 HANA industry right now. But just to start, what are some of the biggest trends you're seeing in the S4 HANA space in your coverage of the ecosystem there?
Well, I think probably the big picture statement is to say that the S/4HANA adoption process is going a lot slower than SAP surely wanted it to when they introduced S/4HANA. It's actually been 9 years ago, February 2015. I think I did the math right. So,
I did not realize that. It's already been 9 years.
yeah,
It doesn't
it's
feel like
been a
that long.
while. Time
Yeah.
has flown. So, and I saw a quote by Liz Herbert of Forrester, who was pointing out similar sort of take on it, that this is behind schedule for SAP. And anecdotally, I've noticed that a lot of the case studies we hear about are for the on-premises S/4HANA. So sometimes, SAP would kind of wants folks to believe that a lot of the implementations are for S/4HANA Cloud. And it
Right.
turns out, especially in the early years, it was really the on-premises version, which is more feature rich.
Mm.
The cloud version has been gradually catching up in terms of feature richness and functionality. But a lot of the companies really needed to start with on premises. And so the other thing that happens is a lot of these migrations, and we saw this again anecdotally and to some degree statistically a few years ago, were to S/4HANA Finance. So that's a partial move where they're moving just the finance component, the accounting component of S/4HANA. Well, they're moving it maybe to on-premises S/4HANA, but they're more likely to go to the cloud for that because then you can have this more generic process, which accounting typically is for companies. You can have that be more global because it's on the web. But then they were still leaving a lot of most of their on-premises SAP systems on premises. They weren't really making the full move.
Okay.
So, in fairness, um, I should point out, I was checking the earnings transcript recently. Um, S/4HANA Cloud revenue, according to SAP, it has reached 1/10 of total revenue. So they were talking about it being well over 3 billion euros. And that's actually a pretty good number, I would say, for a company with so many products and such a long history. And
Just
assuming
for
that
the
they're not.
cloud? Are you talking about
Yeah,
just for
and
the
I think
cloud
this for
version?
S/4HANA Cloud, I was really
Okay.
kind of surprised in that, their cloud number that they give for all the cloud products is the vast majority now of their revenue, which I always think is suspect because I know that Oracle has done this over the years too. They have a very loosey-goosey definition of how they count things as cloud, but
Right.
they broke out S/4HANA Cloud, and it was a pretty impressive number just last month in their quarterly earnings call.
Wow.
So yeah, so I guess the the other kind of big takeaway or the major statement maybe to make about where SAP is right now is that it's a critical juncture because with the 2027 deadline coming up for requiring people essentially to move off of the on-premises ECC Business Suite to S/4HANA and S/4HANA Cloud. I think they're at a real juncture, that a real risk of losing business to the competition because if you're having to revisit and kind of open it up to making a pretty big leap to S/4HANA Cloud, especially the multi-tenant SaaS version that can tend to be way different, a lot simpler than what they're used to, then why not look at all of them? Why not look at Workday and Acumatica and the Oracle Fusion Cloud ERP products? So I think it
Yeah.
is a big juncture. It's an area of opportunity, but also great risk for SAP.
Yeah, and it's you bring up a great point, a few great points, which is one of which is that it's not a simple lift and shift. Going from ECC or even worse if you're going from R3 to S4 HANA. That's a huge jump, even more so for R3. How First of all, have you heard this metric? I believe I read a metric recently. It was either from Gartner or maybe McKinsey or Forrester, one of the big analyst or consulting firms. I think it was Gartner. They said that roughly only one third of ECC customers have either started or begun the migration to S4HANA. Have you seen any metrics like that? Or does that ring a bell with you?
It's in the ballpark. They vary quite a bit, but I have seen, um, well, ASUG, the America's SAP User Group, they have done some surveys, and I think the last one was around the middle of last year, and they were showing big percentages of user groups, of users, that is, customers, intending to go to S4HANA, saying that they plan to, something like 86%. And
Mm.
roughly half of those have actually done it. So those numbers are pretty good. On the other hand, I did see a brief from Gartner, which was estimating just recently that 70% of SAP customers still rely on ECC and they have yet to upgrade to
Mm.
S4HANA. And so I think we're seeing numbers all over the place. I think the trend is in the right direction for SAP, but still, as I said earlier, not anywhere near what they would have wanted.
Right. Well, especially with this 2027 deadline to get their ECC customers off of ECC to S4 HANA. Why do you think that is? If SAP has set this deadline of 2027, where they're going to stop support and new R&D and stuff like that for ECC, and you've only got a subset of ECC customers that are actually beginning that migration, time's ticking. Why do you think that is, that more customers aren't moving over sooner? And how do you, in general, how do you think they're adjusting or reacting to that 2027 deadline?
Well, the reasons I think it is, and I've been hearing this from a lot of sources, these reasons from a lot of sources. One is that many of them truly are not so sure that the cloud version, maybe even the on-premises S4HANA, which is still the more feature-rich one, but especially the multi-tenant SaaS version, really does enough of what they need. So they're reluctant. They have customizations. They don't want to have to give up their customizations, which is they know they have to do. They've been told they mostly have to do if they go to the multi-tenant SaaS version of S4HANA. There's that, and I think there's a fair amount of confusion about some of the programs like Rise with SAP and Grow with SAP that are
Right.
meant to ease the migration. There's people are gradually learning about them and understanding them, but up to a year or two ago, and especially when Rise first came out several years ago now, there was a lot of confusion among the user groups about what exactly it is and what it's going to do for them.
Right. Right. Yeah, and I'd love to hear from the audience listening now. Just if you don't mind, just drop in the chat. Have you started your migration off of ECC? Are you moving to S4 HANA? Are you not sure what to do? I'd sort of just love to see the comments here from the audience on whichever platform you're listening or watching here. Be curious to get your feedback. You mentioned another thing you mentioned too is that you made a really good point a moment ago that if you're an organization that is moving from R3 or ECC or any other legacy SAP product to S4 HANA, you might as well consider your other options because it is a complete re-implementation. Are you seeing any trends in that regard as far as in your coverage of the SAP space? Are you seeing more customers that are either frustrated with the mandate with the 2027 deadline, or they're just not sure if S4 HANA is a good fit, so they're therefore looking for other alternatives, maybe more so than they might have in the past when they were evaluating an SAP upgrade?
I'm definitely seeing some anecdotal evidence of that. Just some of the users I've talked to, and this is over several years, and also my colleague Jim O'Donnell, who's the news writer for our SAP site, he talks to quite a few folks. It's clear that it is happening, but I don't have really good evidence or data on that, and none of the analyst firms, at least the stuff they offer for free, seem to be giving out that information, but it kind of stands to reason that companies would be doing that, especially since, as SAP itself has stated, and I think the consulting firms that help people with this migration have stated, if you're going to S/4HANA Cloud, again, I always emphasize, I mean the multi-tenant SaaS version, not the private cloud one that
Right.
is not really what we think of as more pure cloud. It's going to be a greenfield implementation. And I always have to remind myself that's not the same thing as net new. That greenfield can be for a company that already has SAP products. That term
Right. Right.
is often used. So they have to kind of start fresh, but then they have to think about their data migration, what they're going to drop. It's a more of a, it's not exactly, it's certainly not starting new, and that's part of the problem. But so, by mentioning the greenfield, even if they're going to make them stay with S4HANA, they're having to go greenfield. So then I'm back to more of the logic of why they should be looking at and probably are looking at other vendors. Because if you're going to have to do that, then why stick with SAP?
Yeah. Yeah. Makes total sense. What about on the other side? I know you cover more than just SAP. You sort of look at the broader purview of digital transformation and enterprise technology in general. But are you seeing any signs or trends of non-SAP customers that are looking at S4 HANA and looking to make that migration, or is it primarily legacy SAP customers you see making that jump to S4 HANA?
Oh, so you're wondering whether some people are choosing S4HANA
Yeah, if they're
that
on like
aren't.
say Oracle Fusion, or maybe they're on Oracle EBS or an older version of Microsoft Dynamics or a non-SAP product, making that jump from non-SAP to SAP S4 HANA. Are you seeing any trends up or down in that segment of the
I'm
market?
seeing again. I'm seeing more anecdotal. I wish I could give numbers, and I don't. It
Yeah,
doesn't appear that the user groups anyway have really studied it. And if the Gartners and Foresters and IDCs of the world are doing it, they're not making that information freely available, if you know what I mean by freely.
right.
So there's lots of case studies, though. SAP, I can't think of all the names. I know that one is Jabil, the big contract manufacturer. They had a bunch of different systems and went to S4HANA. So you have anecdotal evidence, you have individual case studies, and there's definitely evidence of companies that weren't on SAP before doing that. And it seems like it's usually they're doing it that's when they're going to multi-tenant SaaS, S4HANA Cloud. So
Right.
they're not going to the more complex. They're making a move in the direction of consolidation on the cloud. And that's how they're getting off of some of their other on-premises systems. So I definitely see wins that SAP is getting. And yet, on the other hand, again, anecdotally, Larry Ellison is especially the CTO of Oracle. Every earnings call, he always wants to brag about how they've won business over to Oracle Fusion Cloud ERP from SAP. So it's hard to tell, but it's pretty clear to me that some people who haven't really been SAP customers before are trying out S/4HANA Cloud, especially with Grow with SAP, which does target more the mid market. So,
Right.
and I think maybe some smaller companies can use that too.
Yeah. 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 I want to come back to that grow and rise initiatives here in a moment because I want to dig into that with you. But speaking of Larry Ellison, and just to build on what you just said, I've seen anecdotal evidence as well, or anecdotal stories of companies that have gone from SAP to another product. I mean, one that I just read about recently, and by the way, in our client base, I don't know of any customers that we're currently helping implement S4 HANA that weren't already on an old version of SAP. So, that's a small sample, relatively small sample. We don't have tens of thousands of clients, but, of the dozen or so SAP implementations we're supporting right now worldwide, I believe every one of them I know is going from legacy SAP to S4 HANA. But, I have seen actual examples outside of our client base. One that I read about that maybe you read about too recently was the Birmingham City Council in
Yes.
Europe. It's the
Hmm.
largest local government entity in Europe, and they went from um, SAP to Oracle Fusion. And Larry Ellison, called it out as a big win for them, which it was. But they had a complete disaster on their hands, and there's a bunch of news that's come out recently about that implementation. So, not to say you're going to fail if you go from legacy SAP to non-SAP, but that's even a bigger jump, I would argue. Even though S4 HANA is a completely new product, there's at least some familiarity of the, for better or for worse, that SAP look and feel. People that know SAP ECC, generally are going to pick up on S4HANA faster than trying to pick up on Oracle Fusion or Microsoft Dynamics or whatever the system may be. But that's a broad generalization, of course.
Yeah.
How do you see S4HANA competing against Oracle and Microsoft and Workday, some of these other big ERP and enterprise tech vendors? How are they holding up? How do you see them competing right now in the market in general?
If you asked me that a couple of years ago, I would have said, having gone to a lot of the Oracle conferences, well, the main conference, Cloud World, formerly Open World, I would have said that the Oracle Fusion suite, which includes a human capital management module, which SAP has to do by having success factors, which they own, but it's somewhat separate product. I would have said that Oracle was clearly ahead, and I have said that in some of the things I've written. But lately, it does seem like with all the things that SAP has added to S4HANA, and this goes back 3 or 4 years roughly when they started, they got stronger with adding logistics and procurement, a supply chain whole module, I guess. It seems like they've reached rough parity. And I was looking at a Gartner Magic Quadrant for the product-centric products. So that's ones where you got to have a manufacturing component. It's not the service-centric piece. And they were saying roughly the same thing, that S4HANA has gotten quite strong in its capabilities. So, and this is something I wanted to ask you, Eric, because as you pointed out for many years, Microsoft is almost always on the short list for a lot of companies when they're narrowing it down and making their decision. And yet, to me, maybe I'm being a selfish member of the press, they don't blare their horn the way SAP and Oracle do about all the wonderful things they're doing with Dynamics AX. I guess it's usually Dynamics 365 now. They don't tend to brag as much about the things that they're doing with their ERP product, and yet they still have really good market share and are on these short lists. So I'm wondering, are they staying competitive with Oracle and SAP and maybe even Infor, or are they kind of lagging in terms of developing what they're doing with Dynamics?
That's a great question. I mean, if I had to hypothesize on why that is, why they're not tooting their own horn or pounding their chest whenever they have these big wins, like Larry Ellison's the exact opposite of that. He will make sure that everyone knows when the Oracle gets a big win. But I think the difference with Microsoft that maybe works against them or doesn't allow them to have that same bravado is that you have they're very decentralized in how they sell their software, so it's all through VARs and resellers, whereas SAP and Oracle are getting involved, in their direct sales force. I think Microsoft's doing a bit more direct sales to larger enterprises now than they did, but still most of their revenue, I believe, is coming through the reseller network. So, it's in that decentralization. It's not as well known internally at Microsoft. If they win a big deal, I don't know. I'm speculating, but that would be my guess.
You're confirming my speculation. That's what I wondered, if it was the sales channels are different.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I do think they're, at least with our client base, they are competing well. I mean, we do have more S4HANA customers for sure that are either already on S4HANA and just looking for help optimizing or recovering a failed S4HANA implementation, or clients that are asking us to help with the implementation. I think S4HANA overshadows D365 in our client base, but that's because a lot of our clients are larger, more complex, and they just need or want something like an S4HANA. D365, I think they compete a bit better, I'd say, in the mid-market. And again, we'll come back to this whole SAP Grow thing here in a minute and follow up on this point. But mid-market, I'd say D365 is probably stronger. And in our mid-market client base, we have more D365 clients. So I think it just depends on what, kind of what the needs are. Certainly organizations that value tons of flexibility and open architecture and integration are probably going to gravitate toward Microsoft, especially if they're already a Microsoft shop with SharePoint and Microsoft Office 365 and all the other products. So I think they're competing well. I don't want to say it's better or worse than S4HANA, but they're competing well depending on the market we're looking at. Mm-hmm. What about well, let's I'm going to jump around a little bit from the sequence I was originally going to ask this, but since we keep coming back or dancing around this whole mid-market discussion, SAP has this grow initiative where they're really focusing on the mid-market and trying to make it easier and more tempting for the mid-market to adopt S4HANA.
Mhm.
I presume, or I think, I get the impression that part of why they're doing this is because um, moving mid market, there's more companies in the mid market, and SAP has traditionally struggled in the mid market and smaller organizations as well. So I think they're trying to create an offering that appeals to the mid market. How do you see SAP's Grow initiative? How do you see that sticking? Is that affecting customers? Is it working? What's your take on that?
My take is that yes, that is what they were pretty clear that that's what they were going for. I feel like it's a little early to say how well it's doing, although I did again see Christian Klein, the CEO of SAP, in the earnings call last month. He did claim that they have 700 people, customers, signed up for it. I think that's probably less than with Rise, which is the more high-end equivalent of a program to get people to migrate. But the other thing about Grow, it does seem to be like the mid-market version of Rise with SAP, but it's clearly targeted at the net new customers. And
Mm,
so if I understand net new, that literally is like who we were talking about a few minutes ago, companies that haven't been SAP customers before. And so to me, another thing that and this isn't exactly answering your question, I guess, but what that shows is that SAP knows that it has to compete in this sort of big wide ocean, or maybe even the wild west of these more nimble SaaS, multi-tenant SaaS ERP systems. They
right.
have to have an offering, and it's somewhat confused also because it's been pointed out. My colleague Jim O'Donnell, again, he got some commentary on this, and it stands to reason again that they had Business by Design, which has been their cloud ERP for SMBs, and so now there's some confusion, I would say, and people think that Business by Design is probably on its last legs,
Yeah.
partly because it is appearing to be redundant now. So I have an idea what SAP is doing and trying to do and why they need to do that with Grow with SAP, but I don't have a good sense yet of what kind of uptake there is for the program.
Yeah. Yeah. Part of me wonders if it's a kind of a slick marketing campaign. It sounds good in theory. How does it translate to reality? I guess that'll be the question that
Yes.
we've got to consider. And if you're listening here and you're going through an S4 HANA implementation, especially if you're part of that Grow program or the Rise program, love to hear your
Yeah.
comments in the feedback or feedback in the comments field below. Um, you also one thing that you've covered, or when I say you, I mean TechTarget as an entire publication and media outlet. You guys have covered a lot with some of the ASUG user group surveys that SAP has conducted in recent years. What are some of the key findings that you guys are covering in some of those user surveys, and
Mhm.
what's interesting that you're uncovering there?
Well, as far as actual surveys, we've seen in the ASUG, the Americas user group, and then the UK and Ireland user group, which is quite vocal, and also our Computer Weekly uh, site in London covers that quite a bit. Um, that is, both of them are showing surveys strong intention to adopt S4HANA, and roughly half or a third of the total respondents uh, actually doing it. And so another interesting number I saw, I don't have the percentages right in front of me, but this is, I think, a UK Ireland result again, that the reason people said they were going S4HANA wasn't because of the wonderful features, which is what SAP often touts. It was because of the 2027 deadline.
Uh,
Um, yeah, so uh, I guess maybe that's not surprising, but it doesn't seem ideal because it's the cudgel, it's
right.
and yeah, it doesn't seem like the best reason to make a move, and there's all sorts of problems with it, which we've kind of touched on a few times here. So the other thing, now this is not in a survey, but the real big noise we heard from user groups in the German speaking user group, I think people call it informally DSAG. It's for the German speaking countries, not just Germany over in Europe.
The
And
Deutsch SAP user
yeah,
group.
the Deutsch, right? That's it. And they, when Christian Klein, the CEO, again, very explicitly made an announcement last year, mid to late last year, that SAP would no longer put its leading edge innovations. It's not that they wouldn't do any updating of on-premises products, but they wouldn't put the AI, I guess maybe the blockchains in there, probably some of the IoT, the Internet of Things features that they've been talking about for years, that would only go in S4HANA Cloud. And people were outraged. I mean, they literally sounded and expressed a sense of betrayal because many of these users were companies that had made the move to S4HANA on premises. So this comment about innovation only happening in the cloud, it really affected companies that had already gone along with SAP earlier, back when S4HANA itself was first introduced, as we said 9 years ago, and been among the earlier adopters. So they feel,
Right.
there's another word for it. There's more than one word for it, but let's just stick with betrayed.
Right.
So
It
yeah,
is.
and those are, go ahead. I'm
It's
sorry.
interesting you bring that up because that it sort of validates a qualitative feeling I get from SAP customers. I look at our clients, and the reason they reach out to us is because of it's part betrayal, it's part distrust, it's part anxiety, it's part uncertainty. There's just a lot of. I don't think it's a good long term play for SAP to do what they're doing. It's working. I mean, on one hand, it's working. You're getting customers to do what you want, maybe not at the pace you want, but you're getting them to convert to S4 HANA, and eventually you want to get them to S4 HANA multi-tenant cloud. That's the ideal utopia, I would assume, for SAP. But in the
Yeah.
meantime, it is working. But in the meantime, how much damage is it causing their brand, and just the trust that you would expect to see? I've never seen a distrust at this level in my 25 years. And there's always been a healthy level of distrust in the industry to begin with, but it's pretty high right now, in my opinion. I don't know if you see that as well.
Yeah, I have, and I think it's worse than ever. And you can't blame people. There is a sense it's not a monopoly situation, but companies feel somewhat locked in. The
Yeah.
lock in was supposed to go away, I think, years ago, but in reality, I think with all the investments they've made, especially if they've heavily customized on-premises ERP, they feel a bit locked in, and so I think they feel probably a little pushed around. I don't know how much time we have for this, Eric, but there's one kind of clue, I think, into how SAP is gradually recognizing that they have to soften their stance here. Just last month, they introduced RISE with SAP Migration and Modernization Program. And that's essentially a deal sweetener that lets the on-premises ECC and S4HANA owners get a one-time upfront credit. Now, they have to,
Mm.
of up to half of their existing contract value. I think it's the maintenance contract, essentially.
Right.
So they have to commit to rise with SAP. So they have to say that they're going to make the move. And also SAP at the same time said they would give customers who need more time to migrate, they would extend their existing maintenance by 2 years. And they said that, well, that was starting in early 2024. So we're talking about extend your maintenance up until early 2026. Sounds suspiciously like it's getting really close to the next year, 2027. So
Right.
I know it does seem like it's a deal sweetener. I know Holger Mueller at Constellation Research, he had a similar take on it. So I wouldn't say it indicates desperation because in many ways it does seem like SAP's in the driver's seat here. But
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
know,
Well, time will tell, how those conversions go. One thing I also worry about in this whole um, betrayal scenario that you've described, and the distrust and the forced mandate, all that stuff. One thing it's doing too is it's forcing a bunch of companies to go through a migration at roughly the same time. I mean, you've got 3 years until 2027. So presumably in the next 3 years, you're going to see a burst of activity of companies trying to move off ECC or R3 onto S4HANA. And how is SAP going to support that? How is the ecosystem going to support it? Are we going to be able to find skilled resources that know S4HANA really well and can support our project effectively? I think there's a lot of fallout that we'll see in the next 3 years as a result of that spike in demand and the inability to service all that, call it artificial demand that's being created by SAP.
And if people want to do it, they're going to pay through the nose, because part of the big part of the mechanism SAP is offering is the big system integrator companies, especially if it's a large implementation through the RISE program. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And one thing we'll talk about, and we have a guest in a future episode from Rimini Street, which is a third party SAP maintenance provider, is really just talking through, what options do you have if you feel like you're at risk of not hitting that 2027 deadline. It's not the end of the world.
Mm-hmm.
SAP will try to convince you it's the end of the world, but what do you do? And there's other options you can pursue. There's alternatives, pros and cons, of course, to those alternatives, but it's important to understand all those. So that's something we're going to cover in a future episode in more detail. But do you see, have you seen any evidence of customers that are looking for ways to extend that support past 2027? Or are we still too early to where customers are just still trying to figure out what to do, when to do it, all that good stuff?
I think it's probably a little too early. I haven't heard anyone, and again, this is really anecdotal, saying, oh no, we're going to do this in 2028, 2030. They haven't been talking that far ahead, but there definitely seems to be interest and demand for, and like you mentioned, Rimini Street, and there's Spinnaker support, probably a few others that I'm not less aware of, but that can help companies extend the life of their on-premises, and all the growth and the explosion really of integration tools and different cloud options, and the growth of so-called composable ERP, where you piece things together, which is what SAP is trying to get people, and kind of really almost requiring people to do with their ECC, and then with S4HANA Cloud and the different varieties of S4HANA. Well, you can do that also with another brand, or you can do it with your on-premises. You can do it with your on-premises business suite, and you can have companies like Spinnaker and Rimini Street helping you do it.
Yeah, absolutely. So just to put a bow on all this and sort of wrap it all together, everything you've talked about so far, David, what are some of the biggest recommendations you have for SAP customers that are moving to S4HANA? Either they're thinking about it, they're about to get started, maybe they're just early in the process. What are some of the big takeaways you'd leave the audience here with?
Well, my top thought is, and this may be wishful thinking, but try to hold SAP's feet to the fire. I think perhaps customers might feel like, again, they are not in the driver's seat, but SAP does still need their business. And they are, I would say, more than in, let's say, 10 years ago, at threat of losing business to even smaller companies, but especially the big competitors like Microsoft and Oracle and Infor. So I would say, don't be shy about pushing back, and especially ask about the cloud deployment options and the different versions of S4HANA. I think there's still a lot of confusion there, and some of that I think is promulgated, especially by SAP marketing, where they just try to put cloud on everything and make it sound wonderful. But in many cases, you are doing a lift and shift, and some of the cloud offerings that they're talking about are really cloud infrastructure offerings, and so it's just a complicated thing. So I would say, really, really ask a lot of hard questions and push SAP to explain your migration path, and the different options, some of the more affordable options, such as extending existing products that you have through integrations and these extensions, just through like the business technology platform. And you mentioned the third-party support providers like Rimini Street and Spinnaker. They can help you do a lot of these partial moves and get some of the leading edge technologies like AI without fully dropping your on-premises. And so I guess that would be my advice, is to really push and ask for some real answers from SAP.
Yeah, and I might add to that list too. Just know what you're getting and what you're not getting. You mentioned, be sure you understand, are you really getting a cloud solution? Is it multi-tenant cloud? Is it private cloud? Is it on premises? there's a lot of different variables to factor in just to know exactly what you're getting. And then, the other thing we see too is that a lot of ECC customers in particular that are used to the maturity and the well-developed solution that ECC has become in the last couple decades, they don't realize that despite all the advancements that S4HANA is making in AI and machine learning and Internet of Things and the HANA platform obviously is a whole game changer for SAP. So there's some definite upside improvements that S4HANA has made in the product, but there's also some things that are just missing. Things that ECC could do, especially in call it complex manufacturing environments or a really diversified organization where they just haven't had time in the R&D dollars yet. Despite 9 years in, we're not 30 years in or 20 years in like some of these other legacy products. So they're still maturing the product in some ways. So you do want to know what you're not getting and where the gaps are, just so you can, if anything, know how to manage that risk and know if you're gonna customize S4HANA, or you're gonna put a bolt on in place, you're just gonna do a workaround, because that'll materially affect your implementation timeline and cost. So that'd be the one thing I add too, is just do sort of a fit gap analysis to really understand what you are and aren't getting and versus what your needs are for S4HANA.
Yeah.
So, well, good. Well, I appreciate you being here today, David. Great conversation. And this is super helpful. You've got a unique perspective having covered the S4HANA space for some years now, but also just the SAP ecosystem for even longer. So I really appreciate your insights here.
Well, thanks for having me on, Eric. It's always fun to chat.
Yeah, I'd love to have you again. And yeah, we'll see you next time. All right. Awesome. Well,
Okay.
let me stop recording and make sure this uploads.